Okay, today we get to talk about subtracting integers. So last week, we wrapped up the week with adding integers, and we got to use the counter chips to model what that looks like. So we got a little bit of practice of finding our zero pairs, using the rules that we learned for adding. So today I'm going to introduce subtracting, and there's something in the top right of your corner. It says blank and blank numbers. We're just going to remind ourselves that integers are positives and negatives. So they are basically made up of positive and negative numbers. The big tip at the top says that subtracting an integer is the same as adding its opposite. So in a moment, when we start practicing adding or subtracting integers, you're actually just adding the opposite to the first number. So when you see minus, like this example here, in the very beginning with our C-level activity, a lot of you were asking, why do we have absolute value bars around that number? They are not absolute value bars. They're parentheses to separate the negative from the minus sign, so it doesn't look like minus minus or plus minus. It's putting that negative number in the parentheses to separate it from whatever operation is happening. So when you see minus a negative, you are actually going to change this to plus or positive number. You're changing it to plus a positive. Okay, so if it's minus a negative, you are now going to plus a positive. I used to call it keep, change, change whenever I taught it when I taught 6th grade before. I would name it keep, change, change. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple of examples where you are seeing the actual tip given to us, where we are subtracting an integer, where it is actually showing that we are adding its opposite. So looking at that first one where it says 3 minus negative 8, I'm actually going to change it to 3 plus the opposite of negative 8 is positive 8. And so it equals 11. So my answer to 3 minus negative 8 is actually positive 11. I'm adding the opposite. Okay. Now, what is just 20 minus 3? 17. Okay, it's 17. If I asked you, if I said, okay, well, what is adding the opposite of that? It would be 20 plus negative 3, which is 17. Okay, but there's no need to change all of that when I have a whole number that's a positive minus another positive whole number where it stays positive. So we don't have to go through the steps of doing keeping and then changing to positive or plus to changing to a positive. That's unnecessary when we have a problem that looks like this. But what about this? Negative 20 minus 3. I could rewrite that so that it looks like this. Negative 20 plus, what's the opposite of 3? Negative 3. And what's our rule whenever I have two negative numbers that I'm adding together? I just add them like normal. I just add them like normal. So 20 plus 3 is 23, but because they're both negative, it stays negative 23. Now, could you think of that, picturing a number line, like our C-level activity? If I'm at negative 20 and I subtract 3, I continue to move down, right? So we can picture that in our mind because our numbers are pretty small, and I know I'm going to end up at negative 23. But this is where that rule, that algorithm up here, my tip, that is how this is working here too. All right, let's try this next one, negative 5 minus negative 8. I'm going to keep my negative 5, but I'm going to change to a positive, so I'm actually adding positive 8. What is my rule when I have a negative plus a positive? You've got to remember your rules from Friday that we talked about. Something about the bigger number.
The bigger number is negative or positive.
Okay, so the bigger number is going to tell me if my answer is negative or positive. But what do I do to figure out my answer, Avery? I subtract the absolute values. Do y'all remember this from Friday? Okay, so the absolute value of -5 is 5. Absolute value of 8 is 8. So I'm just going to subtract my absolute values, which equals 3. And I'm going to take the sign of the bigger one. So it's going to be +3 as my final answer. So when you are subtracting with integers, you're basically creating it and changing it into an addition problem, which is why we started with the rules for addition first, because you got to know those before we start subtraction, because you're changing your subtraction problems into an addition problem. If you know your rules for addition, then you're set. You're good to go. Okay, -7 minus 2 is basically the same thing as -7 plus -2. Adding the opposite. I'm changing from minus to plus. The opposite of 2 is -2. So now my rules for addition, if my signs are the same, I add and I keep the sign the same. So -9. Okay, what does it look like with counters? This is where it gets a little tricky, and we're not going to do a counter activity today, but I am going to show you, and we're going to have it in our notes so that you have an example of what that might look like. Okay, so again, yellows are my positives. So I'm going to show 3 positives, but then it says I need to add enough 0 pairs in order to subtract 8 negatives, because here I am supposed to subtract 8 negatives. Well, if I don't have any negatives to subtract, I've got to add 0 pairs so that I have enough. This is where it gets a little tricky. So I've got to add enough 0 pairs so that I actually have negatives to take away. So if I need 8 negatives, I can go ahead and add my 8 negatives here. But I got to make sure that I include a 0 pair. So that means I also need 8 positives to go along with it. Because I can't just add in 8 negatives to take away. If I'm going to add anything, I got to add in a 0 pair, like a pair of a positive and a negative. Now what I'm going to do, I have 3 minus -8. So I'm going to take a, oh, whoa. Let me change the size of that. So I want to take away 8 of these negatives. And what am I left with? I have 3 here plus 8 here. So it's +11. So here's demonstrating what is happening. When I'm changing minus a negative, I'm actually adding a positive. So I'm changing that from 3 minus -8 to 3 plus 8, which equals 11. Okay, it gets a little tricky once you start trying to model it with counters, but that's what it will look like. Okay, now on a number line, it's really not any different than what we have been doing. So you're going to start with your first integer. I'm going to start by showing 3. So I'm going to go to 3. And then I'm going to subtract -4. But what do I know I have to do when I'm subtracting a negative? I'm actually doing what? Adding a positive. So I'm going to continue moving to the right 4 places. And I end up right here at what number? 7. Okay, so when subtracting negatives, I move to the right. When subtracting positives, which way do I move?
Left.
To the left. So subtracting a negative is like adding a positive. Okay. All right, now we're going to combine the two. So I know how to add, I know how to subtract. What if I have multiple steps in one? Let's refresh our brain on the adding rules. A negative plus a negative will always equal a negative. A positive plus a positive will equal a positive. When I have negatives and positives added together, I need to use the sign of the bigger or the larger number. Okay, well, what if I have 3 or more numbers? like a positive plus a positive, and then I'm adding a negative? Or what if I have a negative and then I want to add a positive? Very good. I am going to find the sum of the same signs first. So it's all going to depend on sum of same signs. So Blakely said I'm going to combine the ones that are matching already. So I'm going to combine all of the same signs. So in this one, I would do my positive plus my positive first, and then I would add the negative and take the sign of the bigger of the two. If I had two negatives, I would add those first, and if this sum is larger than my one positive, then my answer is going to be negative. Okay?
Wait, can you say that again?
Yep. So if I have 3 or more numbers, I'm going to add together what I have the most of. So if I have more positives, I'm going to add all my positives together. Okay, in this case, I have 2 positives. So I add these together. If the sum of these 2 positives is bigger than this one negative number, so say, for example, this is positive 5 plus positive 9, okay? And I add that together, that's positive what?
14.
Okay, but this is only like plus negative 5. Then I know my answer will be positive because when I combined my positive numbers, that is going to be bigger than just the negative 5. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so subtracting. It's kind of similar. Subtracting is the same as adding its opposite. So don't forget, when we subtract integers, we are basically adding its opposite. So what happens when I have 3 or more that I'm working with? All I want to do is just work left to right. So if I have a positive minus a negative, then I would do that first. Then I would subtract the last number. In this case, it would be subtracting a positive last. In this one, I would just do a negative minus the positive first, solve that, and then subtract the negative. You just go left to right order. Then you add your opposites. Okay, so let's look at some examples because right now it might sound confusing, but when you see it, I think it'll make more sense. Okay, my first one is 3 minus negative 7 minus 5. I'm going to work left to right. So the first thing I'm going to do is rename this one to 3 plus positive 7. Why? Because when I subtract a negative, what? You're actually adding the opposite. So I am adding, instead of subtracting, the opposite of negative 7 is positive 7. So what does that equal? 10. And then I subtract 5, so my final answer is 5.
But would it be negative or positive?
It's positive because I have positive 10 minus positive 5, so it's just 5. Okay, the next one is a negative 8 minus 6. Well, if I rewrite that so that I have negative 8 plus the opposite, I'm changing minus to plus. Opposite of positive 6 would be negative 6. So what does this equal? Negative 8 plus negative 6. Negative 14. Then I can subtract negative 3. Notice how I've brought this next part down here. So I solved this part first, got negative 14. Now I'm going to finish. Negative 14 minus negative 3. I've got to rewrite that so that it's negative 14 plus 3, which equals negative 11. You're just working left to right. Left to right, baby steps. Okay, do you want to try the last one and then check it?
Yeah.
Try it and see. It's not going to hurt if you get it wrong. You can fix it. Maybe independent and then check with your team, and then we'll check whole class.
adding two numbers. Like if it's like if this was normal 2 plus, if it was negative 2 plus 3, then would you change it to subtraction like you do with subtraction? Like addition.
You would be subtracting your absolute values.
Okay.
Okay. So in this one, you're going to rename it so that you are adding the opposite instead of subtracting the negative. So 4 plus, opposite of negative 2 is positive 2. So 4 plus 2 is 6. The last thing I got to do is add the 3. So 6 plus 3 is 9.
I told you. Wow, I got it right. Parentheses. What? Yeah, because you don't think it's a positive.
It's just separating it. I don't know why. Absolute value is straight bars. Straight up and down bars.